So this is the demo for looking at some of the more detailed ways to approach your burnishing methods. So on the top here I've got some things started. They've got multiple layers on them, but we're going to start building them up with many colors and just continually adding more pressure as we go, which is the most controlled and probably the one that most of you are going to find you kind of stumble into as you're working. So I already had some layers. I'm just going through now. I'm actually am burnishing with the white with a pretty hard pressure on the tops of these petals because I know that I want that to stay white, and by applying a white burnish there, nothing's gonna accidentally go over it later and become a color that I don't want. So when burnishing white, also make sure the bottom of your white colored pencil is clean, which is what I was doing there. So burnishing the tops of these white, getting them sort of all smudged in together where I know that those colors are the things that I want. And now using a pale yellow and just starting to add colors with a medium pressure, and then a pink with a light to medium pressure. So each of these is just a little heavier than the ones that I went before with. And so they're slowly going to start blending together and just burnishing on their own. So that's why this is the controlled method. At no point is this all entirely sealed to me. I'm just going through, and you can kind of float around and touch different areas without ever having to worry that you've made a drastic change that you can't undo. So you can see I'm starting to get a little more pressure up, especially in the light areas. I tend to work from light to dark. So I'm checking in, adding a little pinks, and then burnishing those into these tops of the whites, adding a strong white layer. And then that medium, very pale yellow is what I'm starting to burnish down the midtones where they blend into the pinks and the yellows on this. And it takes a while, especially with this method, because it feels like you're not seeing a lot of payoff all at once, like you'll see in some of the ones at the bottom here when we do those, but you're seeing payoff because it is slowly closing the pores of the paper. It's taking out that sketchy feeling, it's adding more painterly technique. It's just slow and steady. And continually checking my reference and realizing, oh, I need more saturation down here. So even that little section that was burnished with white, I can still go over it because the wax will still reactivate, and I can add some of these deeper purples and hotter pinks and oranges and start really blending them up from there. So now I've got kind of a mid-tone with a pretty heavy pressure. I'm letting that pink overlap both the darker areas I made below and the white and yellow burnishing that I started at the top. So this mid-tone, when it overlaps both of those, is so using that mid-tone to blend together all the layers underneath it. At this point, we're about maybe 80% to the maximum capacity of the paper and colored pencil. So I know that as I'm going through, I'm just slowly adding more pressure, slow and steady, blending all of these layers together. Always overlapping a lighter shade as my top layer over the darker shades so that you get that seamless blend in between the two. Which is why I'm now going back with that yellow and that white, and then it'll be pale yellow to start really getting that nice smooth transition through all the colors. Mostly using a directional stroke that moves up and down, but occasionally using circles and small areas to break up the strokes I can see underneath it. I use white colored pencil a lot, which is why I asked for you guys to have extra, but I didn't realize they sent like more pastel-y ones, but that's what I use for a lot of my blending, my top and final layers. It adds a bit of a cool tone to things as you go over it. And I'm mostly using very blunt pencil edges for this, like I mentioned, so that way we're not making hard gouges, it's not cutting into the paper, it's not creating lines that are hard to go over, but you can still apply plenty of pressure with it. Now I'm moving on to the petal that's right next to it. I like to work in sections when I'm doing things like this, because you're not going to then accidentally go over a dark section with your light pencil and pick it up and smear it into the dark area. So try to think of moving consistently between either levels of color or directionally the way you want to be blending so that you're not carrying color into an area you don't want. So on this one, you can see I've already got a whole bunch of layers of color down, but they're just not feeling very vibrant. So in the source image, this has a lot more vibrancy. So I'm going to burnish pretty much the entire pear shape here with yellow. and it's going to pop all the greens. It's going to mix in that purple and make it into a nice shadow color. It's going to bring the oranges and the reds to life underneath. So with pretty hard pressure and a circular motion, I'm going to kind of crosshatch, rehatch. I'm getting it from every direction using circles to apply pressure to seal this all in and mix this yellow tone across all of the pair. So here I've switched to a little bit darker version of the same yellowy orange, but I can go back over the areas I just laid down that yellow, allowing those two layers to blend together and create a middle tone in the burnishing. And now over this last shadow area, I'm going to use a dark orange, heavy pressure, and burnish this area in, and then overlap again with the lighter areas so that there's not hard edges. But you can see it's kind of, it a little bit obliterates some of the layers underneath it, but it does still give a lot of vibrancy, unifies it. So there are about 8 layers of color under that, and I still just went over it all with pretty much one shade. So by coating it entirely in yellow and then moving into a deep orange, and now I'm using just a little bit of red on top of that burnishing to add in a little bit of vibrancy and deepness into those purple tones. So now we're looking at this bottom section. So I've done 2 different skin kind of Caucasian swatch ups. They have a whole bunch of vibrancy in the shadows. There's a lot of greens and purples and pinks. So for the first one, I'm going to entirely blend the whole thing with just a white colored pencil. So I'm going around and doing a lot of circular motions. I'm going to go around and blend all of the areas that are light in tone first, so similar tone. So that arc across the top, the areas that are highlighted in the folds and underneath the eyebrow that have pretty much the closest and lightest shade. I'm doing those all first. So I'm keeping my pencil from smudging too much into those purple areas that I'm about to get into. So then you can go around and do all those purple areas. I'm using a lot of pressure, and I'm using a circular motion to smudge out the pencil lines so it feels more painterly, except for where I want more direction. Then I'm going to use a very sharpened pencil edge to go in and do the fine details around the eye. So I want to blend directionally with the eyelid going over the eye. I want to blend directionally with a sharp pencil, you know, everything that's in the underlid, the waterline. I want to use a sharper pencil when I'm doing anything that's a small controlled area, and then a flatter pencil to do all the rest of it. So you can see that just by using a white colored pencil, it's really unified. It's changed the texture of this piece. And it's also really made it feel a little bit more painterly, a little bit more closed in. It's married all the layers. It's like adding a flatten filter on Photoshop when you just like merge all the layers. It's sealed, it's done. We can now do some glazing on top of it if we want. We can add hairs and eyelashes. But all those underneath colors are now nicely blended together. So I did not touch the inner eye until now because those are a different color tone. So I'm going back in with my white, still only a white pencil, and blending all of those areas along the white of the eye and then along the iris. Using directionality in the iris so that the brush strokes are always still pointing to the pupil. So for the one on the right, we're going to use a combination of a white colored pencil where we want to maintain highlights and a very pale like beige pencil. Pale pink, kind of brownish beige. So you'll see how this essentially, all the underlayers are the same colors, but these 2 different burnishing techniques or burnishing tones kind of change how the end result is. So I'm using the white in anywhere I want to maintain a highlight. So that's the rim of the waterline, that's a couple little areas along the top of the eyelid. It's in very small areas, and I'm going ahead and just burnishing those white. It doesn't matter if they're perfect because I know I'm going to go over them and burnish them with this pinkish color anyway. So now I'm burnishing all the way around with the pink color. I'm going over everything with the same amount of pressure until I get to the edges of areas that were burnished white, and then I can start to see how it doesn't want to add as much tone there. So it's nice because those are preserved. I can't really mess it up by going too hardcore over them. So you can see that this is creating a very different skin tone than the one on the left, which has a very cool, very pale tone. This one has a lot more warmth to it. It has a lot more pink and a feeling of, you know, almost sun-kissed on it. They've been like out running or something. But it does obliterate more of the undertones, but it also brings to life some. So since there's more yellow and a beige, you're seeing a lot more of the greens and yellows in this one, even though they're present in both. It's emphasizing those. So when you're planning what color you want to use as your unifying layer, so that's how I sort of think about this type of burnishing, is using it as like a final unifying layer. It's going to put everything together. I often use a light color that is also close to the mid-tone. Close in hue to the mid-tone, but much lighter. So then I can go back in and add a couple little shadows, a couple little areas. I can use the white to really pop in the white of the eye, because I certainly don't want to do the white of the eye, you know, in peach. So you can kind of burnish it all in, add those final details, and it really comes together. So I'm going to use the white here to do also the highlights that I left in both of the eyes, because they usually have a bit of a watercolory, shimmery feel to them. Add a couple extra little points of contrast. But as you can see, burnishing in 2 different colors has rendered the underlayers entirely differently. So you can use burnishing as a great tool to unify, but also to be your main mid-tone. You can use burnishing to be your highlights. You can use burnishing to like a filter, where you're applying it over the whole thing to brighten it like we did on the pear. You can use it like we did in the petals, where you're slowly building up all the sections at once, which is very controlled. But I think I probably use it the most like I've used in these skin tones, where I use it as a unifying layer and also as a swatch almost.